If you ask me, there are better ways to spoil an afternoon than having the front doorbell ring just as I was setting out Wolfe's beer. Fritz had polished the glass to his usual standard, and I had the tray in hand, ready to deliver it to the plant rooms. Nothing punctures domestic tranquility like a stranger on the stoop, especially when it happens on Wolfe's sacred 4 to 6 orchid hours. The bell didn't just ding, it insisted. Whoever pressed it was either nervous or pushy. My money was on pushy. Wolfe doesn't like interruptions. Neither do I when they put me between him and his suds. I opened the door to find a man who didn't match the bell's insistence. He was lean, dressed in a tweed jacket that had seen better seasons, and carried a satchel clutched like it might bite him. His hair, the color of tarnished brass, was combed but not tamed, and his eyes had the sharp glint of a man rehearsing lines in his head before speaking. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked, voice dry as toast. "That's the name," I said. "And you're auditioning for?" "I need to speak to Nero Wolfe, urgently." Of course he did. Nobody ever rings to borrow a cup of sugar. I considered telling him Wolfe was occupied, because Wolfe always is between 4 and 6. But there was something in the way he clutched that satchel. Not desperation, not exactly. More like he was afraid of losing whatever was in it. And fear, I've found, can be contagious. I stepped back. "You can come in, but if you've got designs on orchids, you'll have to wait." He gave the barest nod, walked inside like he'd rehearsed that too, and stood in the office as if the chair legs might snap at his weight. I set Wolfe's beer down on his desk, a silent bribe to smooth the interruption, and told the fellow to park it. When Wolfe finally emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth like a surgeon post-op, his brows were already engaged in combat. He took one look at the man, then at me, then at the beer. "Archie." His tone was reproach wrapped in resignation. "Explain." I gestured toward the satchel. "He says he's got urgent business. I didn't frisk him, but he looks more like a school teacher than a thug. Unless he's packing a dictionary in there, I'd guess that satchel holds the key to his problem." The man set it on his knees and spoke, each word measured. "Mr. Wolfe, I wouldn't intrude if it weren't important. My name is Leonard Ames. I'm a curator at the Metropolitan." That tilted Wolfe's head a fraction, which for him was like someone else doing cartwheels. "A museum man," he murmured, lowering into the chair behind his desk. "And what distress, pray, afflicts you to breach my orchids?" Ames opened the satchel. What he drew out wasn't art or relics, but a small, flat wooden box with a sliding lid, no larger than a cigar case. He placed it on Wolfe's desk with care, as if the weight of it might buckle the mahogany. "This," he said, "was found yesterday inside the hollow of an oak tree in Central Park. Its contents are peculiar. The problem is, someone knows I have it, and they want it back. I can't trust the police, and frankly, I can't trust my colleagues." He slid the lid halfway to reveal a dark velvet lining. I caught the glint of something metallic, something etched. Wolfe, without moving closer, fixed his gaze on the box as though it were a chessboard set with only one piece. The room went still. Even the city noise outside dimmed as if waiting for Wolfe to speak. Finally he did, slow and deliberate. "You will leave the box here." Ames' face flickered, equal parts relief and dread. "Then you'll help me." "I haven't said that," Wolfe replied. He lifted the beer, took a sip, and set it down. "But you have disrupted my plants. The obligation is mine to restore equilibrium." I didn't like the look in Amy's eyes. It wasn't just relief anymore. It was fear, doubled. And if Wolfe was taking the box, I had the feeling the equilibrium around here was about to take a beating. Leonard Ames sat stiff in Wolfe's red leather chair like a man afraid of leaving an impression. The satchel was still on his lap, even though the box it had held was now resting on Wolfe's desk like a guest nobody had invited, but everyone was watching. Wolfe had leaned back, eyelids lowered, The look he gets when his mind is either cracking a puzzle or quietly arranging a funeral for whoever delivered it. I knew better than to interrupt, but silence wasn't Amaz's strong suit. "You don't understand," he said, leaning forward. "It isn't just a curiosity. What's inside, what it might mean." "What it is," Wolfe corrected him, "will suffice for the present." He flicked 2 fingers toward me. "Archie, oblige us." I didn't need more than that. I reached for the box, slid the lid back the rest of the way. Nestled in the velvet was a small metal disc, tarnished with age. It wasn't perfectly round, more like the smith who'd hammered it had a personal grudge against circles. One side bore markings, etched lines in an interlocking pattern, part spiral, part grid. The other was plain, except for what looked like a notch or bite missing from the rim. I turned it under the light, half expecting it to hum or glow. It didn't. "Looks like something you'd get at a flea market," I said. "One man's treasure, another man's paperweight." Ames bristled. "That's not just scrap. I believe it's connected to a collection at the museum, an undocumented piece, possibly 16th century. But I didn't find it catalogued. Someone hid it deliberately, and now—" He stopped, swallowing the rest. "Now," Wolfe supplied, "you are hounded." "Yes, since yesterday. A man followed me out of the park. I'm certain he trailed me to my apartment. And this morning, my office had been searched, papers disturbed, drawers slightly ajar, though nothing missing. At least, nothing I could identify." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "You brought it here because you cannot rely upon your colleagues or the constabulary." "Why?" Ames hesitated, then sighed. "Because I suspect one of my colleagues planted it, and if that's true, involving the police would only alert them further." That hung in the air like smoke. I studied him, weighing the way his knuckles whitened around the satchel strap. He wasn't lying, but he was holding something back. They usually do. Wolfe closed his eyes. "So, you have given me a trinket of dubious origin, the assurance of menace without proof, and the suspicion of betrayal without a name. What am I to do with this? Mr. Wolfe, please." Ames leaned forward so suddenly the chair creaked. "I don't know who to trust, but if I'm right, then someone at the museum is using me as a pawn, and if I'm wrong, then you have wasted my time." Wolfe's eyes opened, steady and flat. He tapped the box once with a fingertip, then pushed it half an inch closer to himself. "But you are correct about one thing. The object is not trivial. That much is evident. The question is, what is it worth? Not in coin, but in consequence." I could see where this was headed. Wolfe wasn't interested in chasing petty thieves, but give him a whiff of layered deceit, and he perked up like a hound at the scent. Still, there was the matter of his orchids. "I'll make the call," I said. "Saul, Fred, or Ori?" "None," Wolfe said sharply. "Not yet. There is no field for them to till. You will, however, accompany Mr. Ames to his domicile, confirm his claims of intrusion. Note who observes you." That meant I'd be spending my evening with Mr. Curator instead of anything more entertaining. Judging by the sweat on his temples, he'd make poor company. Ames nodded quickly, relief written in the slump of his shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. You don't know what this means." "On the contrary," Wolfe murmured. "I know exactly what it means. It means inconvenience." He waved a hand, dismissal wrapped in formality. "Archie, see him out. Bring me dinner at the appointed time. I will, in the meantime, examine this object further." I got Ames to the door, pausing just long enough to give him the rules. "When we leave later, you walk naturally. No head swivels, no nervous glances. If someone's tailing you, let me spot him. Clear?" "Yes, clear." He said it too fast, too rehearsed. After he was gone, I returned to the office. Wolfe was already staring at the disc as though it had volunteered for dissection. He didn't look up. "It is not precious metal," he said, But the etchings are precise, and the wear is uneven. Someone handled it repeatedly, always along the same lines. That bespeaks utility. Utility for what? A bottle opener. His lips twitched, which for Wolfe passes as belly laughter. Bring me Mr. Ames's address after dinner. And Archie, yeah? Be circumspect. This may be less about antiquities than about men's ambitions, which are older and infinitely more dangerous. By the time Fritz rang the dinner bell, the box was closed again, resting on Wolfe's desk like a secret that had settled in for the night. That's how the sanctity of the brownstone cracked, not with a bang, but with a tarnished disc from a hollow tree and a curator too nervous for his own good. And I had the distinct feeling that by tomorrow the crack would be wide enough to let in a flood. Dinner kept its appointment, and so did I. Wolfe finished his squab with the concentration of a man solving Euclid, and if he noticed me watching the clock, he didn't say so. When Fritz cleared, Wolfe pushed back, breathed the way he does. That means his stomach and conscience have reached a treaty, and dismissed me with a nod that contained an itinerary. I picked up Amy's on Madison a little after 8. He'd changed his tie and nothing else. The face still had the doughy look of a man who'd been kneaded by worry. We got a cab, and I watched the glass as much as the street. The trick to checking for a tail is to be as dull as the next lamp-post and twice as reflective. On 59th, a black sedan took the same turns we did, then lost interest at Lexington. Either he was clumsy or cautious. Either way, I made a note. Ames's building was the kind of place that promises hot water and mostly delivers. The hallway smelled like old varnish and ambitious dinners. He unlocked a second-floor door and stepped aside with the air of a man bringing a guest home to meet his embarrassment. At first glance, the room hadn't been ransacked. The armchair had its stuffing inside, the books were on the shelves, and the rug wasn't wearing anyone's footprints proudly. But you don't need overturned furniture to know when somebody has had a look around. You only need dust. On the desk, a row of paper clips had been nudged into a tiny parade. At the bookcase, a slim history volume had been returned to the wrong regiment. And on the mantel, a little brass horse was 2 inches left of where it had stood long enough to draw a pale halo in dust. I've seen politer burglaries. They are the worst kind. Yesterday morning, I asked. He nodded. I left for the museum at 9, returned at 7. I noticed then, the horse, the drawer. There's a scraping when you pull it too far. I never do. I bent to the drawer and pulled. The scrape came right on cue. Inside were bills, a checkbook, and a note card that belonged in an academic's pocket. Tidy, square-cornered, penciled in the kind of script that apologizes for its own legibility. It read, Hollow Oak, map overlay, Harrow's grid, ask Sophia, revarnish. I held it up. You wrote this? Yes, he said reluctantly. Translated. He swallowed. There's a 16th century map in our European collection, unattributed. Years ago, my predecessor marked a speculative grid on a tracing, trying to match a fragmentary survey of New Amsterdam. I noticed a similarity, purely geometric, between that grid and the markings on the disk. I meant to ask Dr. Harrow, she heads our department, why the grid existed at all, and Sophia Wren, our conservator, about a resinous smell on the disk. Like old varnish, not soil. Names. That was what I was here for. Let's put some faces on those syllables. Start a roster. He sat, and the chair granted him mercy. Dr. Muriel Harrow, brilliant, territorial. She runs European prints and drawings. She believes exhibitions should be earned by decades, not months. That puts you where? On month 22. He looked at his hands. I had a proposal for a small show. If this disc connects to the map, if it could justify a thesis. That's not why I brought it home. Of course not, I said. Who else? Victor Liddell, development liaison. He courts donors, and donors court the walls. If an object can be paraded before a purse, Victor will schedule it for a waltz. Potential motive, Access to donors with a shiny mystery, I said. Next. Sophia Wren. Careful, precise. She can tell you what century a smell belongs to. She and Dr. Harrow get on when they need to, which is less often than the work requires. And security. Owen Capel, former police, now head of museum security. He likes rules and the people who follow them. He thinks I color outside the lines. Anyone else hovering? Interns, tempers, tempters. Peter Malloy, graduate fellow. Eager, maybe too much. He idolizes Harrow and thinks the rest of us should bring her fresh chalk and gratitude. It was enough to lay out a little parade of human motive. Territory, prestige, money, purity, and the youthful urge to be noticed. Those will lift more objects than a forklift. I phoned Wolfe from the hallway with my back to the stairwell, just in case the sedan had grown legs. He answered like I'd woken him from a nap he wouldn't admit taking. I gave him the list and the lay of the dust. Good, he said. Mr. Ames's colleagues form a tolerable circle. The note? I read it. Varnish, he repeated, savoring the word like a morsel. And the grid. You observed anything else? Only a black sedan that liked our route and then changed its mind at Lexington. Noted. You will take Mr. Ames to the museum in the morning and observe his associates in their native habitat. You will not reveal my interest or existence except as a rumor you cannot control. Solicit a social pretext for each. A drink, a coffee, or a corridor. I want their voices in your air before they choose their words for mine. You're not calling Saul? Not while the field is still. Words. Report at noon, he said, and hung up because the conversation had ended. Back inside, I told Ames he was bunking at a hotel for a night. He started to object, the kind of objection men make when the price of a room is more visible to them than the price of caution, but I held up the note card and then pointed to the horse on the mantel. He packed like a man leaving a life, and we went down the stairs. On the sidewalk, a woman in a mustard coat passed us, glanced at Ames, then at me, and then away with a practiced speed I've seen on people who don't want to know what their eyes already stored. At the corner, the black sedan wasn't visible, which proved nothing. I got Ames a room under a name that belonged to a man I knew in Ohio who wouldn't be using it, and I told him to stay there, sleep on his back, and answer only to the name Leonard. At 9:45, I was in my room at the brownstone reporting to the ceiling. The ceiling gave no opinion. Downstairs, Wolfe would be studying the disc the way a gourmand studies a menu he has already memorized. If the etchings were a pattern, if the notch meant alignment, then the thing wasn't jewelry. It was a key. Keys belong to locks, and locks belong to people who want to keep things in or out. I don't like either when they breathe. Morning came with the sound of eggs. Fritz knows how to make them behave. Wolfe ate at 9, I at speed. At 10, we were a block from the Met. I kept our reunion with culture casual. Inside, the marble and the hush did their usual double act. Ames took me through corridors that smelled faintly of dust and wealth. He introduced me as a friend who writes about history. That is not the worst lie ever told about me. Muriel Harrow met us in a narrow office with walls lined by books that used to line other walls before money was invented. She was tall and centered, with hair the color of a decision. Her eyes did arithmetic on me and got a remainder she didn't like. "Mr. Ames," she said, "your proposal is premature. Scholarship is not Instagram." "I came to ask about the grid," he said, and put the tracing on her desk like a kitten that might learn to purr. "From Dannon's notes?" Her mouth did not move, but the temperature in the room changed. "Where did you get that?" "In the archive," he said. "It was true in the same way that rain is wet. There are varieties. Return it after you're done misinterpreting it." We left. In the hallway, a man with 2 white cuffs detached himself from a conversation with a painting and offered me a smile he had borrowed from a salesman. Victor Liddell, by his tag. He had the kind of handshake that confides and the kind of cologne that claims square footage. "Leonard, you mustn't hide your friends," he said. "We have a donor breakfast Friday, little pastries, large checks. Bring him. We should talk about your project." "What project?" Harrow said behind us, without a question mark. Victor's smile tried to be a peace accord and settled for a ceasefire. He drifted away, leaving behind a whiff that would survive a small storm. We cut through conservation, where the air had the nervous clean of a hospital. Sophia Wren looked up from a table where an old wood panel lay under lamps like a patient under scrutiny. She had fine hands you could trust with a cracked century. "Leonard," she said, warm but preoccupied, "if you're here to ask me to bless a new theory, bring me coffee first." "Varnish," he said, "pine or copal, on a small metal disc." "On metal," she frowned. Why would anyone varnish metal, unless they wanted to seal a transfer? "What sort of transfer?" I asked. "A rubbing, an ink impression, something that would need fixing, or to keep skin oils from corroding a surface meant for repeated touch." Utility. Wolfe had said it. I thanked her in a way that meant I would return with coffee and questions. Security was a glass box near the loading dock, and Owen Capel filled it like a chair fills a corner. Completely. He had the habit of squinting only one eye, which makes a man look as if he's always sighting something. "Mr. Ames?" "Sir," he added to me, because he didn't know what I was and didn't like it. "Anything to report?" "Only good manners," I said. Peter Malloy, the graduate fellow, found us by the elevators. He had a haircut that had read a book and a grin that had not. "Dr. Harrow said your draft is, well, ambitious," he told Ames, in the tone of a man delivering a compliment wrapped in homework. To me, he said, "Are you part of the show?" "I'm the man who asks where the exits are," I said, and he laughed like he had decided to. By noon, I had voices and faces, and the feel of a machine that had been humming along long enough to mistake its own noise for music. I phoned Wolfe from a bench that had listened to Wealth sit down before. "Dr. Harrow protects, Mr. Little promotes, Ms. Wren conserves, Mr. Capel controls, and Mr. Malloy admires," I told him. "Sophia says varnish on metal might fix a transfer or protect a surface meant for touch." Harrow didn't like the sight of a grid. Little smelled opportunity. Security sniffed the air, and an old tracing has everyone's posture up. "Good," Wolfe said. The word was heavy enough to hold a plan. "Bring Mr. Ames home at 3, and Archie, on your way out, take a long route. If the sedan returns, I want our courtship to proceed." On the way out, I let the museum swallow us in 3 different directions before we reached the street. I've never liked straight lines when someone might be drawing one on me. We took 5th to 79th, cut across to Madison, drifted down 2 blocks, and paused at a window full of impossible shoes while I watched glass. It took a minute. Then our old friend turned up at the curb. Black sedan, chrome board with its own reflection. This time it didn't pretend to be a taxi. "Keep walking," I told Ames. "Admire the footwear. Imagine a world where those are for men." "I'm not very good at this," he said, trying to be good at it. "You're fine. Just don't announce you're fine." We moved. On 75th, I stopped to tie a lace that hadn't come undone and got my glance. 2 notches over the shoulder, not 3. The driver was a square man with a neck that didn't allow much poetry. No hat, close hair, sunglasses doing a half-hearted job of being the night. When we turned east, he didn't argue. He let the light decide. At Park, I hailed us a cab and took the back seat with a view. He followed for 6 blocks, then slid off when I had the driver cut west through a knot of delivery trucks that would offend a saint. I caught the plate's first 3 letters and the dent on the rear bumper. A crescent, like the car had tried on another moon and decided it didn't fit. It would keep. Back at the brownstone at 3, I handed Wolfe the essentials. Letters off the plate, crescent dent, square jaw, and the flavor of the museum since breakfast. He had the disc on a square of linen and a blow-up photo of the tracing I'd made with my phone, printed by my small office sin against aesthetics. He didn't look at me until I was done. He was listening to Sophia's varnish remark without her being there. "Touch," he said. "It was meant to be touched, not held, not displayed. Touched, repeatedly, along fixed paths. The notch is for registration against an edge. The etchings are a guide." "A guide to what?" "To coincidence," he said shortly. "Where lines converge, where a grid aligns with a terrain. Mr. Ames, your Harrow grid was drawn on a tracing of the old map." Ames nodded. "By a curator 2 decades ago, there was a theory, never published, that certain survey marks corresponded to something lost and then mythologized. He called it the hollow oak overlay in his notes, but that was a joke about the park, not a code." "There are no jokes in serious men's notebooks," Wolfe said. "Only camouflage. Did you speak of this disc to Harrow?" "No, only the grid. So she is alert to the fact of a grid, not its marriage prospects. Good. I told him about Victor's donor breakfast." Wolfe grunted, which in him is a sentence with clauses. "He will want novelty to rattle the checkbooks. Mr. Liddell is not patient enough to arrange a burglary. He's patient enough to encourage one. Mr. Keppel's vigilance is sincere, but indiscriminate. Miss Wren is exact and, therefore, dangerous to anyone who is not. Young Mr. Malloy is adhesive. He will carry whatever sticks." "And the sedan?" I asked. "Not a police car, a private man, perhaps engaged by a colleague or by Mr. Ames's own fear. The dent is useful. Make it more so." I rang a friend in the registry end of things, and left the plate fragments and the crescent for later retrieval. Then I went to the kitchen for coffee, because Sophia had earned the offer, and because a man who's been watched deserves a cup that isn't lukewarm. Fritz promised a thermos that could pacify a winter and gave me a look that meant guests had consequences for schedules. He is right. In this house, schedules are religion and strangers are atheists. Before I left again, Wolfe said, "Bring Ms. Wren here this evening if you can contrive it without melodrama. I will not have a parade, but a single keen mind may shorten a day." "You're taking a shine to her," I said. "I take a shine to accuracy," he replied, "and to anyone who doesn't say Instagram in my hearing." At 4, I had Sophia on the phone, my voice carrying the thermos by implication. Conservation runs on caffeine and attention. I offered both. She agreed to meet in an espresso joint a block from the museum where the tables were small enough that secrets had to sit on laps. She arrived with her sleeves pushed up and the look of someone whose brain was still in a debate with her hands. "You came prepared," she said when she saw the thermos, "and not to flirt." "I'm loyal to information," I told her, and poured. "You said varnish on metal might be to fix a transfer or protect repeated touch. Who would check out varnish from your supply for something off the books?" "No one from conservation without a form," she said, sipping. "But forms are imitated. We had a hiccup last month, a request slip for a solvent that looked right until it didn't. The initials were PM, but the handwriting was too tidy." "Malloy? He doesn't touch solvents," she said. "He touches footnotes. But someone wanted it to be his hand." She shrugged. "Owen flagged it. He has a nose for improvised permission. Keppel knew Malloy's initials were borrowed, and the stuff was never used on any piece that shows it." "On any piece we know about," she corrected. "If you're fishing, Mr. Goodwin, say what for." "A disc with etchings and a notch that lines up with a grid someone drew over a very old map. Found in a tree the way a squirrel finds religion. Smells like resin." That got the rest of her attention. "You'd need the map," she said. "More than a tracing. The paper, rag content, stretch, any warping. All that changes alignment. If someone is using a disc as a moving mask, they'd need to lay it on the original to get a true meet." So whoever searched Leonard's place wasn't just looking to steal a shiny. They were looking for where he keeps his eyes, and the original isn't in his apartment. It's in the vault, she said. Access by appointment only. Harrow decides. Owen unlocks, and Liddell watches from a tasteful distance. And if someone wanted a private audience with parchment, they'd need Harrow to want it too, or Owen to believe a signature. We finished the coffee because it was sin to waste it. On the way out, she stopped me with a hand on the sleeve. If you're going to let your Mr. Wolfe see the disc, tell him it's not iron. A magnet shouldn't touch it, and if he has talc, a dusting might show finger paths. He'll be touched you're thinking of his talc, I said. One more thing. Were you at the museum late the night before last? Until 8, she said. There was a panel from the North Gallery that needed humidification. Why? Because a polite burglar came to say hello to Leonard's pens. I like to know who has alibis even when no one's dead. She made a face at the word burglar that wasn't fear. He's too earnest to notice when he's in danger, she said. Be earnest for him. Back at the brownstone at 6, the house had that listening quality it gets when Wolfe is thinking in more than one direction. He had the linen square out and a dusting brush beside it. Powder traced thin threads where fingers had traveled, and they weren't random. They spiraled from the notch across 3 shallow grooves and back again as though someone had learned the path and kept to it like a prayer. The pattern made a shape my brain wanted to name before it knew it. Good, Wolfe said without looking up. It persuades me. The disc indexes the grid to a specific latitude on the paper. Once aligned, the spiral is a route. A route to what? I asked. To compulsion, he said. Men hide things for any number of reasons. They retrieve them for only one. He turned his head a degree. Tomorrow morning we will invite Ms. Wren to bring us a photograph of the full map at scale. We will not request the original. Yet. And tonight? Tonight, he said, you will phone Mr. Liddell and imply that Mr. Ames is considering showing his prize to a private donor in exchange for a promise. You will not say a donor's name. You will say that the donor is impatient and vulgar. It will flush the right sort. And if it flushes the wrong one, then we will have learned who is willing to soil my carpet to fetch what he wants, he said. And Archie, lock the front. I distrust the air. It wasn't paranoia. The brownstone has weathered more stupidity than the city has bridges, but there was a hum beneath the plaster now, the kind you hear when a wire has been nicked somewhere in the wall. I went to the door and slid the bolt. When I came back, the little wooden box was where we'd left it on the desk, the lid closed, the linen folded, the disc asleep. Wolfe poured beer and attended to it the way a man attends to a liturgy. I'd barely finished dialing Liddell when the bell rang with a kind of nervous politeness, the sort a stranger uses when he's brought a favor you didn't ask for. Wolfe's eyes closed, which means they opened inward. Answer it, he said. If it's the air, it has learned how to knock. I went to the door with Liddell's number halfway dialed and a suspicion already formed. The bell rang again in that well-bred tempo he'd use on a dowager's townhouse, and when I opened up there, he was, hatless, smiling like an apology with teeth. Mr. Goodwin, he said, as if we were old injustices making peace. I was in the neighborhood and thought, ridiculous of course, that Mr. Wolfe might indulge a brief word. I wouldn't intrude, but I've heard a rumor I cannot ignore. Rumors work out daily in this city, I told him. What's yours, bench press? A private donor, he said smoothly. Impatient, vulgar, so I'm told. Being courted with a prize. If my institution is to be involved, even indirectly, I have to ensure proprieties. Behind me, Wolfe said, Let him in that tone a magistrate uses when he's decided on bail. I stepped aside. Liddell entered with a pleasant, practiced glance at the foyer that missed nothing and implied he wished to. He made a show of taking no more than 3 steps into the office, then pretended to be surprised by Wolfe, who had not moved a muscle. Nero Wolfe, Liddell said, the vowels polished. A pleasure deferred too long. Perhaps, Wolfe said, State your business standing. It will keep you brief. Fair enough. Little clasped his hands, relaxed them, and let his gaze fall casually on the desk and the small wooden box on it, as if it were scenery. An anonymous whisper reports that a certain curiosity might be paraded before money without the museum's counsel. If Mr. Ames has done something rash, I'd prefer to correct course before reputations, including his, become involved. Mr. Ames, Wolfe said, is under no obligation to disclose his friends to his employers, and the museum is not a monastery. Its reputations are fortified daily with hors d'oeuvres and checks. Why are you here? Little smiled as if we were fencing, and he appreciated a riposte. Because money loves novelty, and novelty loves trouble. If there is a curiosity, it will find a room, with or without us. I'd rather it be with us. Perhaps I can persuade Mr. Ames to share his excitement under proper auspices. You can attempt persuasion tomorrow, Wolfe said. Tonight you may content yourself with conjecture. He nodded, accepting the rebuff like a man who had learned not to fight the tide. He drifted a half-step, angled for a better look at the desk, and caught himself as if that had been an accident. His cologne arrived half a second before his sleeve did. He spared the box a glance so fleeting it might have been innocent. Nothing else in the room was innocent. Then I'll say only this, he said. There are patrons who will pay for the privilege of sharing a secret, even briefly. If Mr. Ames is tempted, ask him to call me before he makes a mistake. He put a card on the corner of the desk with 2 fingers, graceful, deliberate, and his sleeve grazed the box's lid by the width of a heartbeat. Good evening, Mr. Wolfe. Mr. Goodwin. I saw him out and noticed what he wanted me to. The black sedan idling a respectful distance down the block, the square driver studying the curb with deep devotion. Little's eyes didn't follow mine, which told me enough. When the door was shut and bolted again, I went back to the office. Wolfe hadn't moved except to move more inward. Little, I said. Brought his own shadow. Same car. Same haircut. He would, Wolfe murmured. A man who courts money outsources his conscience and his caution. I went to nudge the box an inch farther from the edge. It wasn't where I'd left it, and Wolfe said, "Don't," quick and low. His head turned, just that, and his eyes touched the lid the way his fingers had touched the disc earlier, with appetite bridled by rules. 3 millimeters, he said, and turned a hair counterclockwise. You saw him brush it. I smelled him, Wolfe said, and something else. Pine. I bent without touching. The grain along the lid didn't match the grain along the base quite the way it had. You don't need calipers when dust remembers. On the linen square, the talc I'd watched him use had a new faint stroke, the barest crescent not matching my earlier handling. It came from the lid's edge to the notch and stopped with discipline. I looked at Wolfe. He was listening to silence the way some men listen to instruments. He knew where to reach, Wolfe said. Not to impress, to test. Men who only covet will lift. Men who know will align. He aligned. Which makes him what? An understudy for a thief. It makes him part of a conversation we weren't invited to, Wolfe said. He knows the notch is not decoration. I cracked the window shade an inch and watched the sedan idle, then pull away with that smooth, slow roll that keeps plates unreadable. It turned at the corner like a man changing his mind. Do we give Ames a spanking for telling tales out of school? I asked. He told no tales, Wolfe said. We did. I instructed you to flush a bird. Consider him flushed. And the pine. He inhaled, delicate, like a man sampling a bouquet with his pride in check. Not furniture polish. Resin. Ms. Wren's realm. Little wasn't in conservation this afternoon. He's been in rooms where that smell attends. Vault rooms, I said. Possibly, or his sleeve brushed the disc elsewhere. He didn't need to see it here to recognize it here. Fritz came, quiet as a verdict, and retrieved the beer glass. He replaced it with a fresh one as if the first had disappointed him morally, then left. Wolfe watched the glass the way a planet watches a moon. "You let him touch it," I said. "I let him try," Wolfe corrected. He touched the lid. "That will suffice." "What do you want from it?" "Prints. He didn't leave any. He wears discretion." "I want the rhythm," Wolfe said. "The rhythm of everyone's interest." Today, Ms. Harrow recoiled from a grid she pretended not to know. Ms. Wren reached for explanation before caution. Mr. Capel sniffed procedure. Mr. Liddell arrived too soon with a rumor we had given him minutes before we could possibly have given him. That pace is not coincidence. Someone had him staged at the curb. "You think the driver is his or shared?" "Shared," Wolfe said. "He's a resource rented by anxiety. Tonight he was Liddell's. Tomorrow he will be someone else's. Find him." I nodded. "I've got his dent and 3 letters. I'll shake the tree." "Gently," Wolfe said. "The fruit is not ripe." The air shifted. Maybe it was the radiator deciding to live again, or maybe it was my nerves noticing things they're paid to. I crossed to the front and checked the chain. Still set. I glanced at the side window. The latch was home. When I came back, the box sat like a guest who has decided to stay until breakfast. I hate hosts. "Anything else move?" I asked Wolfe. "Or am I getting sentimental about wood?" He pointed with his eyes at the letter opener on the blotter. An old silver leaf that usually pointed left. It pointed right. I would have sworn I hadn't touched it. The shift was petty and deliberate. The signature of a man who needs you to know he can breathe your air and not cough. Subtle trespass, polite as burglary gets. He wanted to be remembered, Wolfe said. Or someone wanted us to make a mistake noticing him and not another. Meaning? Meaning he isn't alone, Wolfe said, and his talent is theater. I picked up the phone and dialed Liddell like we'd been interrupted. He answered in a voice still warm from our door. "Mr. Liddell," I said, "our hypothetical vulgar donor remains hypothetical. If Leonard decides to be less hypothetical, you'll hear it from me." "I'm relieved," he said, sounding it, and then added, too quickly, "I do hope Mr. Ames is safe." "He's safer than most," I told him, and ended it before he asked me how I knew. Wolfe had the disc out again, the linen repowdered, the brush doing its patient ballet. He angled the lamp so the grooves cast whispers. The new stroke was there, spare and certain. It told a story, and like most stories, it improved under his reading. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will require Miss Wren's photograph of the full map at proper scale. You will also reacquaint yourself with Mr. Capel, and you will miss your lunch to do so. And Archie." "Yes?" "Wake Mr. Panzer." That wasn't melodrama. It was logistics. When Wolfe says Saul's name at night, it means the morning will be too late for comfort. I rang and left the kind of message Saul understands. 3 letters of a plate, a dent shaped like a new moon, a face with a built-in visor, and a car that treats corners like suggestions. When I hung up, the room felt smaller by an inch, and the box looked bigger. "Archie," Wolfe said, eyes still on the grooves, "that sedan will return before dawn. He will test whether we sleep. We will not." "Speak for yourself," I said, but I already knew I'd be conducting the night watch with coffee and a chair by the window. The brownstone had been nicked. A man like me minds that. A man like Wolfe minds it more, in silence. Fritz arranged a pot of coffee like a priest laying out chalice and plate, and I hauled a chair to the front window with the ease of a man who's done night school. The street had the vacant look it gets after midnight, when even honks seem to yawn. The black sedan made good on Wolfe's prediction around 1:10, easing into view as if it had considered staying home and decided to be brave. It idled far enough down the block to flatter its discretion. Lights off. The driver's silhouette was cut square, the kind of head you could fold shirts on. I settled in and let the coffee do the ethics. Wolfe remained in his chair, eyes closed, hands folded on the slope of his middle like a pharaoh who took up thinking as a hobby. Every 15 minutes or so he opened his eyes, glanced at me, and closed them again, as if to make sure I hadn't changed species. We didn't talk. The house listened. At 2:20, a second car nosed in, smaller and paint-chipped, and took a spot 3 doors up. A man in a mustard coat got out, took 2 steps, and didn't look our way. It wasn't the woman from earlier. This mustard had broader shoulders and a gait that had opinions. He walked past our stoop, kept going, and vanished around the far corner. I wrote down his plate too because I'm greedy. At 3:04, movement paid off. The sedan's door opened and shut with the sound a heavy man makes when he tries not to sound heavy. He didn't come to our door. He crossed the street, slow, then quicker, and took the brownstone opposite like an old acquaintance. Up the steps, down into the areaway, and then silent. If he thought he was invisible, it was only because the night humored him. "Wolfe," I said low. "Our admirer has gone to confession across the street." He said. "He prefers a view. Let him confess." He opened his eyes. "Do not oblige him with theatre. If he wants a silhouette, give him a chair." I gave him a chair. At 3:30, when even New York gives in and pretends to be quiet, a hair at the back of my neck stiffened like it had seen duty. The hall had a different draft. It came from the rear, thin as a string. I looked at Wolfe. He had felt it too. His eyes had narrowed a degree. He didn't move, because moving is for people who have to. He said, "Archie," and that was all. The rest was in the tone. I went softly down the hall, letting the house tell me where it hurt. The kitchen was orderly enough to pass an inspection. The back door latch was true. The window over the sink had its lock still down. Fritz is not casual. Then I saw it. The cellar door was shut, but the bolt, usually slid, was sitting proud. A hairline of darkness at the jamb. No sound from below, which is the kind of sound that means someone is trying. There are several ways to greet company when they sneak in through your ribs. One is noise, another is waiting. Wolfe, being an advocate for conservation in all things except food, prefers waiting. I slid the bolt silently home, then put my palm against the door and felt it. The faintest pressure back, like a man testing whether wood will argue. It did. I held it a count of 10, then padded back. "In the cellar," I said in a whisper. "Gentleman caller." Polite enough to close behind him, impolite enough to try upstairs. Wolfe's mouth tightened. "It will not do," he murmured, and reached, not for a phone, not for a gun. Wolfe keeps neither close, but for a small brass bell Fritz uses to call us to meals when the voice of cookery ought to be obeyed. He handed it to me. "If he breaches, sound it. Do not be heroic. Heroism is a vice." We waited the length of a psalm. The pressure at the cellar dwindled, then ceased. 10 minutes later, a soft scrape rose from below like a secret embarrassed to be heard. Whoever he was, he had decided our spine was less welcoming than our skin, and retreated the way he came. I left the chair long enough to check the backyard from the upstairs landing window. A shadow shrank, resolved, and went over the rear wall with a practiced slither. The smaller car started 2 blocks down and vanished like a modest thought. "Okay," I told the room. "Now we know the size of the choir." 2, Wolfe said. "One to watch, one to pry. They are not incompetent, also not imaginative. They will return by daylight, scrubbing their methods for legitimacy." "Meaning?" "Meaning a warrant drawn in crayon, or a call dressed as courtesy. Secure the house at dawn, and fetch Mr. Panzer at 8. His eyes closed again. "I will have 2 more hours of this tedium." At 7, the city resumed burping. Fritz brought eggs that had never known a hard day and coffee that forgave us the night. I called Saul. He answered the way Saul answers. A vowel, then silence while he aligns his interest. The plate's 3 letters, and that crescent got you something? I asked. 2 possibles, he said. Both registered to outfits that rent men as a service. I'll put eyes on the garages. Your square jaw belongs to a Mr. Wexler, sometimes Wilson, ex-uniform, now private. He works by the hour and leaves no poetry. Shared resource, I said. Shared, he agreed. One of his clients this week is a firm that does cultural logistics. That's boutique for moving expensive things quietly. Name? Thorne and Malloy, he said. Malloy is in Peter's uncle. Peter's rent is paid by a trust with that name stuck on it. Different Malloy? Maybe, but the city's small when it wants to be. And the mustard coat? Belongs to a red Civic registered to a Ms. Sophia Wren, Saul said. Relax. She loaned it last night to a friend in conservation who lives 2 blocks over and returns tools late. He's got shoulders, not mustard. The coat's a studio smock. I breathed again. You're a lullaby, Saul. 9 at our place? 9, he said, and hung up because that's how friendship sounds on a phone with Saul. At 9 on the dot, the bell gave a civilized suggestion. Saul slipped in with the posture of a man who has never once been surprised by a doorman. He took the chair by the globe in a way that didn't look like he was taking anything, and I gave him the night in a paragraph. 2 crews, or one that bills twice, he said. Your cellar guest knew the lock, but not the bolt. That's personal recon or a map. I'll see where our Mr. Wexler eats his donuts. Before he could leave, the bell struck again. Firm, official, the way institutions knock when they'd like to borrow your privacy. I answered to find Owen Capel and a second man with a blank lapel and a face that had seen daylight but didn't approve. Owen's squint was set to city standard. Mr. Goodwin, he said, sorry to call unannounced. We had a report that a museum asset might be in private custody without authorization. I'd like to clear that up, with your permission. Permission, I said, is what people ask for when they already have the nerve to come in. We can wait on the sidewalk, he said, and make this untidy. Behind me, Wolfe said, Mr. Capel, do not bristle. Come in. I stepped aside. He and the blank lapel entered like a weather front. Wolfe did not stand. We receive you as courtesy. You will not touch a thing. Capel measured Wolfe, found him immovable, and compromised with the air. Word is, Mr. Ames has in his possession an object discovered on museum grounds. If that's true, it's museum property. I'd advise you to assist us and end the confusion. Wolfe's lids lowered. Advice, he said, is a kind of noise. The object you allude to is here for study by an independent mind, because the minds responsible for its safety have been porous. The museum will have it when I am not better placed to protect it than you are. The blank lapel tried to supply paperwork. We can come back with a different piece of paper, Wolfe said, and I will receive you the same. Mr. Capel, your concern is fungible. Who bought it last night? Owen's jaw set. He didn't like that, because accuracy is a threat to men who work by procedures. No one buys my concern, he said. I was told the department had an issue. Which department? Wolfe asked. Development or prints and drawings. That got him. The squint deepened, which is the closest he comes to emotion. I don't gossip. Yet you arrive at breakfast on a rumor that left here at dinner. Wolfe sighed. Gentlemen, you will convey to Dr. Harrow that I require a full-scale photograph of the Dannon tracing and of the underlying map, delivered today by Ms. Wren. You will convey to Mr. Liddell that his presence last night was noted and is not to be repeated, and you will tell whomever rented Mr. Wexler that he is an irritant and that my house is not a playground. Capel looked at me, then at the small box on the desk, then back to Wolfe. That box, he said, is subject to claim. Everything in this room, Wolfe said, is subject to my temper. Mr. Goodwin will show you out before it sours. On the stoop, Capel let the air do a little boxing. You're playing high, he told me. I'm carrying the tray, I said. The man inside decides what's served. He hesitated. Tell Mr. Wolfe this. If something happens inside that museum because of this game, I will come back and it will be untidy. I'll embroider it on a pillow, I said, and closed the door. Back in the office, Wolfe had shifted the box an inch farther back, as if it had offended him by proximity. He sighed, and the room released some tension it had been hoarding. We are near the throat of it, he said. Mr. Liddell's speed, Mr. Cappell's theatre, Miss Harrow's recoil. Someone is moving pieces toward a room they prefer over mine. We will preempt. How? By making the room they prefer mine, he said. Call Ms. Wren. Invite her at noon with the photographs. Invite Mr. Ames to arrive with his gratitude. And call Mr. Liddell with a single sentence. The vulgar donor insisted on a private look today at 4. He will be there by 3:30 with his conscience wearing a flower. And Capel? He will patrol, Wolfe said. That is what he does, and we will let him. Saul will find our square-headed friend by then. I want him in the neighborhood, not at my door. The bell rang again, quick, uncertain. This time it wasn't threat. It was haste, familiar, uneven. I opened to find Leonard Ames, hatless, colorless, holding on to his tie like it would anchor him to the planet. They took the tracing, he blurted before I could ask him to breathe. From the archive, this morning. Harrow says it's misfiled, but it's gone, and someone went through my locker, nothing missing, only moved. Come in, I said, because the day had begun, and subtlety had checked in under a false name. Wolfe closed his eyes for the space of a slow count, then opened them on the disk as if to remind it that it had started this and would sit for the portrait until he said otherwise. Ames stood in the doorway like a man who'd been emptied and forgot where to put the contents back. Fritz took one look and produced a chair and something restorative. Wolfe permitted the glass only because the color in Amy's face had filed a leave of absence. Misfiled, I repeated, the museum's polite word for vanished. Harrow said it happens. He got out. It doesn't, not with Dannon's work. He catalogued like it was prayer. Wolfe adjusted the disc on its linen and didn't spare pity for anyone. Then the chapel has a thief for a sexton, he said. It clarifies the hour. Archie, the calls, as prescribed. I phoned Sophia first. She listened without the usual buffer of professional patience. Gone, she said. Then I'll bring the photographs at scale, and the rubbing we made years ago that everyone forgot existed because it was filed under the wrong accession. Noon. Bless you and misfile freely, I told her, and hung up to ring Liddell. He answered as if he had been standing near a phone for hours, straightening his tie. The vulgar donor, I said, insisted on a private look today at 4. And who? He began. Vulgar, I said. He's anonymous even to himself. 3:30 if you want to be ahead of his vulgarity. I shall be prudent, he said, happy enough to skip asking permission. Saul checked in next, his voice the sound of shoes that never scuff. Wexler parks at a garage on East 73rd, he said. The Crescent Dent Lives. He met a man there who carries a Thorne and Malloy badge and gives orders with a frown. That one got a phone call at 8, after they looked at a street map and your block. They were in love with a rear alley. That romance cooled around 3, I said. You in the neighborhood? 2 corners away. I'll stay until your tea party. We got Ames seated and question-capable. Wolfe asked what he should have asked yesterday but had decided to bide. Who knew you visited the archive yesterday? Malloy saw me sign in. Harrow stops by twice a morning, once for glare and once for glare again. Sophia passed through. Owen came to fix a stuck lock on the cabinet that Dannon used. Wolfe's lids drooped. Mr. Capel fixes locks that resist him. He cannot fix men. He is used. By who? Ames' voice cracked on the vowel. By all who need his keys, Wolfe said. You too. Do not blush. Utility is democracy's only universal. He turned the disc between his fingers just enough to make the talc whisper. The tracing stolen removes uncertainty about your hypothesis. Someone feared the proof of alignment on paper and a confrontation on doctrine. They prefer the confrontation to occur over a find. Find? Ames repeated. If an overlay has a route, it leads to a destination, Wolfe said. Men in museums prefer a discovery that happens on their watch. If they cannot be the discoverer, they will be the watcher who is merely delayed by circumstance. That set Ames blinking like a man arriving from a bright street. You think they'll try to use the map with the disc to take me by the nose, Wolfe said. They can try. Archie, go and fetch Miss Wren at noon and return without shedding her. At 11:45, I left Saul in the vestibule shadow and took a cab to the espresso shop. Sophia arrived with a roll tube that would make a surveyor nostalgic and a canvas tote whose weight said she had combed a drawer that had not wanted combing. We rode back without music. Her jaw was set for war, and I wasn't going to be the soundtrack. In the office, Wolfe had cleared the big table and sacrificed a Brazilian placemat to make space. Sophia slid out a full-scale photograph of the 17th century map and, beside it, a photograph of Dannon's tracing with the penciled grid lines and odd small crosses at intervals like ants marching toward an idea. She added a translucent acetate with the grid in ink. Lastly, from the tote, she withdrew a brittle sheet wrapped in tissue. Don't scold, she told Wolfe. It's not the original. It's a contact print Dannon made for himself. I found it behind a shelf brace where only someone who cleans and curses would see it. Heaven preserve cleaners, Wolfe said reverently. He folded back his cuffs a quarter-inch, took up the disc with 2 fingers, and the room changed temperature. Light, he ordered. I swung the lamp low until the paper glowed and the grooves on the disc took attitude. He set the notch against the south margin of the acetate, near a small ink tick Dannon had labeled with one ascetic letter. Then, with the patience of a man translating himself out of a foreign country, he rotated the disc. Talc traced pale scuffs across the plastic where previous fingers had traveled. On the second sweep, the etchings rode the grid lines as if home were always intended to be this exact intersection. He stopped when a pair of spiraled lines crossed a mark on the map labeled in Dannon's hand. Faint O. Sophia leaned in, forgetting air. Oak, she breathed. He must have noted a reference tree on the earliest park plan. A hollow oak that once stood, Wolfe said. The legend that sent Mr. Ames's find into a tree was literal-minded. But the oak Dannon intended isn't the tree it was placed in yesterday. The pointer line's here. His finger, blunt and decisive, tapped a small rise just north of the ramble, a feature that has made detectives reevaluate shoe leather since city men first decided to be lost on purpose. Not the obvious hollow. A depression near an old boundary stone. Which is, Sophia said, under landscaping now and a bench that donors like to have plaques on. Donors like plaques, Wolfe repeated, tasting the word the way he'd tasted varnish. Mr. Little likes donors. His eyes came to me. They will organize an excursion like a chess player styles a trap accidental. You will go in advance and watch the bench. Take Saul. Do not trespass on soil. Trespass on sight lines. If Liddle's bringing a donor, I said, he'll want a scene. Harrow will want to own the scholastic angle. Capel will want to control the perimeter. Malloy will fetch chalk. That leaves Sophia, Wolfe finished for me, whom we will keep and deprive them of. Miss Wren, you are commandeered. You will be my eyes for any claim of treatment after the find. Sophia looked like she'd been moved on the board and didn't mind. My director will love that, she said dryly. But she sat and watched the disc with the expression of a person who has recognized a fact that won't be bullied. At 1:30, Saul and I took the subway because cars have tails and trains have witnesses. The ramble's edges had the late lunch shuffle, runners with consciences, tourists with maps, and men who believed in birds. We found the bench Wolfe had pointed at. The plaque thanked 3 names for loving the park like a cousin, and parked 50 yards off, behind a stone outcropping that made us tourists too. At 2:10, a familiar black sedan pulled in along 5th. Wexler didn't get out. He watched industriously. At 2:30, a museum van rolled up on a permit it wore like a badge. Owen Capel stepped out, checked the immediate. Then his jaw loosened when he realized this wasn't official and couldn't be made so by frowning. He set up anyway, 2 interns with clipboards, a polite rope line, and the air of preparation. Ames wasn't with them, which meant Wolfe had been obeyed. At 2:45, Victor Little arrived with a man whose suit believed in itself and a woman with a hat that had opinions. Donor 1 and Donor 2. Little smiled as if he'd invented philanthropy. They greeted Capel like a fellow hobbyist and the interns like applause. Muriel Harrow appeared 3 minutes later with Peter Malloy in tow and a portfolio that could have held maps, manifestos, or auditions. She glanced once at the bench and then not again, saving her eyes for the moment she wanted. The quartet, plus auxiliary, formed a little congregation around the plaque. Saul murmured, "The choir." "Missing 1 tenor," I said. "Our square-headed friend." "He'll watch the watchers," Saul said. "Give me your eyes for 5 minutes." He drifted without motion and turned into a jogger who had a new interest in cardio. I kept my sight on the line from Little's smile to Harrow's glare. The woman in the hat asked a question with a hand gesture that made price tags tremble. Little answered with insouciance. Harrow unrolled the portfolio and produced, damn it, a second acetate grid, freshly inked. Malloy held the corners like a boy at a fair. Capel made a show of looking around for approval he hadn't asked for. Then, careful as sin, he eased the acetate down on the bench's back, aligning edges, performing innocence for anyone with a conscience and a camera. Little watched like a proprietor, his donor leaning in. Harrow reached into her bag and brought out, not a disc, but a small, flat envelope. From it, she withdrew a circular brass rubbing, thin as a leaf, pre-cut with a notch. She set it to the corner of the grid and began to turn. "Wolfe," I said under my breath to nobody, because he wasn't there and would detest Benedict Arnold commentary. The rubbing was a counterfeit of the real behavior. They'd made a model. If it landed, they could claim scientific inevitability and call the rest of us superstitious. The rubbing turned. Harrow stopped it at a small cross, exactly 1 pace off the bench's right leg, and pointed down. Malloy produced a chalk the color of certainty and drew an X on perfectly honest flagstone. The donors leaned in further, the hat becoming shadow. Capel glanced at the van, and then at the ground, and then at heaven. Saul returned, breathing slightly more than usual. "Wexler is across the way in the trees with a man who smells like logistics," he said. "If our priests announce a miracle, the relic will be retrieved by ecumenical hands." "They won't dig up a donor's plaque," I said. "They'll lift a stone, which is not digging," Saul said without affection. "Time to interfere." "Time to call the church's rival," he said, meaning Wolfe. I phoned our altar and delivered the liturgy in 3 sentences. "Good," Wolfe said. "You will do nothing. Let them align and point. If they dare to lift stone, photograph them with your eyes only. When they find nothing, they will be susceptible. At 3:20, you will pivot them to me." "Pivot how?" "With indignation," he said, and hung up, practicing what he preached. At 3:15, Harrow gave Capel a nod that meant his conscience could stretch. He signaled the interns, who rolled the rope line 4 feet, and then, with a ridiculous, ceremonious care that bespoke future reports, Capel levered the flagstone an inch. It lifted like it had a hinge. Under it was earth, as ancient and undecided as ever. Harrow's breath didn't catch. She was prepared for a second alignment. She rotated the rubbing the width of a sigh and pointed to a place between the bench legs. Malloy's chalk went down, hopeful, and Capel knelt to pry. Nothing. The donor's smiles thinned. Liddell kept his as an exercise. Harrow tried position 3. The chalk marked, the stone lifted, and the earth beneath remained stubbornly itself. Liddell's eyes darted just once. To the trees. If Wexler was their insurance policy, he didn't look happy about underwriting failure. I let the silence ripen until it was ready for harvest. Then I stepped forward, casual as an old friend discovering new hobbies, and applauded twice, lightly, which is a rude thing to do and a necessary one. "Wonderful," I said. "Now that we agree science is hard, perhaps you'd like to tell Nero Wolfe why you were trying to mislay his afternoon." Liddell flinched. Harrow's jaw did a small contemptuous angle. Capel straightened with a scrape of stone. The donors looked around for a better party. Malloy's chalk snapped in the middle without help. And somewhere behind us, the black sedan sighed in the way a machine does when flesh fails it. I can't mirror that author's exact voice, but I'll keep the same atmosphere. A cool, incisive armchair mastermind, directing a fast-talking, street-smart narrator through a tightening net of motives and feints. Picking up right where we left off, I let the applause fade and gave them a friendly smile I didn't mean. "I'm impressed," I said, "by the choreography. Rope line, portable conscience, and a model that looks good from 3 paces. Unfortunately, the ground prefers facts. If you're done sketching X marks that only mark your expectations, we have a host who dislikes having his afternoon borrowed. Mr. Wolfe will see you now." Harrow didn't blink. "This is a museum matter." "Then bring your museum," I said, and looked at Capel. He already brought the perimeter. Liddell tried to minister to the donors while adapting to a new sermon. "Nero Wolfe, the consultant. It might be useful, Mrs. Danforth. An independent perspective." The hat regarded him like a board reviewing a budget and gave a short nod. Liddell's smile recovered enough to travel. We walked them out like a small parade with a difference. The band had gone home. Saul drifted ahead and melted into a cab that obligingly didn't look like it belonged to anybody. Wexler stayed back among the trees, then pulled out with the sedan and took up the respectable distance a shadow uses to deny it's attached. On the way, Malloy tried for courage. "If Mr. Wolfe has the object, he should return it to the institution." "Correct," I said. "When he decides the institution can keep track of institutions." Back at the brownstone, Fritz received the unexpected guests the way a perfect maitre d' receives late arrivals who are famous for being late. He relieved the donors of hat and the weight of their own impatience. I took Harrow's portfolio at arm's length and set it down where it couldn't offend any paper that had earned gravity. Capel posted himself near the globe with all the grace of a sentry at a picnic. Liddell stood between the room and the donors and radiated sequence. Wolfe looked as if we had interrupted a private treaty between him and his chair, which we had. The disc sat on the linen, the photographs lay squared under the lamp, and Sophia was in the red chair flanking the desk, calm as a surgeon who has washed and is waiting for someone else to decide what organ is theirs. Wolfe said, "Be seated," which arranged them more efficiently than a diagram. The donors took the sofa. Liddell hovered. Harrow chose a side chair and arranged silence on it. Malloy remained standing in the posture of a footnote. Capel pretended to patrol by not moving at all. "You conducted a pageant in the park," Wolfe said without looking at anyone except the disc. "You performed alignment with a counterfeit and announced coordinates on innocent stone. Then, so that you could later claim thoroughness, you tried again. It failed. It could not succeed." "Because the model is imperfect," Harrow said, crisp. "We need the original disc to test the hypothesis." "You needed the original to stage a discovery you could proclaim," Wolfe said. "Mr. Liddell brought witnesses, not scholars." Liddell made a show of being wounded. "I brought interested supporters of culture." "You brought appetite," Wolfe said. I don't begrudge appetite. But today it hungered for theatrics. Mrs. Danforth's hat spoke first. We have given significantly to preserve the city's patrimony. If there is a treasure, we expect prudence and transparency. You have received neither, Wolfe said, from some of these people, and I would not have you pay twice. Miss Wren, the photographs. Sophia rose and slid the full-scale prints forward with the steadiness of a fact. The grid is Dannon's. The rubbing at the bench is a later invention. Who made it? I asked, not because I expected an answer. I wanted the faces to decide whether they had rehearsed one. Harrow did not look at Malloy, which was how I knew she was thinking of him. It was an academic exercise, she said, to test whether a movable index could interpret Dannon's grid. Nothing was taken from the museum without record. Except the original tracing, I said. Her eyes flicked to Capel and back. Misfiled. It walked on trained legs, Wolfe said. Mr. Capel, if you wish to be less an accessory than a tool, stop saying misfiled in your head. Someone wants to prevent what happened here an hour ago. An alignment with the true disk that lands on a spot in the ramble not presently favored by your pageant? Why? Because digging where there is nothing is safer than arriving where there is something, and because if you are seen to fail publicly, you can plead restraint later while retrieving privately. Capel chewed that, grim. He didn't assent. He didn't need to. The donors didn't chew. They swallowed. Wolfe bent the smallest acceptable degree, set the notch to the photograph's margin, and rotated once. The spiral settled into its meeting with two grid lines as if a magnet and a lodestone had exchanged pleasantries. There, he said, a depression near a displaced boundary stone. No plaque. The bench you chose is convenient to driveways and to donors. Convenience is the enemy of truth. Liddell tried charm. Even if you are right, Mr. Wolfe, the artifact, if there is one, belongs to the museum. Perhaps, Wolfe said, but before the museum claims stewardship, it must prove it can keep hands out of drawers, lockers, archives, and men's apartments. It has performed poorly. Mrs. Danforth's hat re-angled toward Harrow. Is this true? Harrow's mouth shortened by a millimeter. We have many hands and few eyes. Today, Wolfe said, you have my eyes. And my house. You have also exhausted my indulgence. His gaze moved at last to Leonard Ames, who had slid into the room as if the hallway had instructed him to apologize. Mr. Ames, you were used. You were followed to see whether you would stumble to the right tree. When you did not, your apartment was tutored. Your note cards supplied the next act's props. You were to be surprised by your colleague's methodical confirmation. Ames colored, then went pale, which is hard work in one face. I didn't think... No, Wolfe said. That is why I'm paid. Capel cleared his throat in a way that confessed nothing and promised a lawsuit. Let's assume for the sake of argument that you have the correct location. What then? You cannot simply take a spade to the ramble. Indeed not, Wolfe said. You will do it. The room breathed and then stopped. Under police observation and under Miss Wren's control, you will call a precinct captain you trust. You will not call Thorne and Malloy or any cousin thereof. You will not call Mr. Wexler. He's outside and will not be employed on this errand. Capel's squint deepened toward respect he didn't like. You have a lot of directions for a man who isn't in charge. I am in charge of my premises and my patients, Wolfe said. And of the disc. You will bring a city official at 4. You, Dr. Harrow, will bring nothing. Mr. Liddell will bring no one whose name appears on stationery. Mrs. Danforth, he inclined his head 1/8 of an inch, may come if she wishes to see whether her money is buying diligence or display. Mr. Ames will stay with me. Why keep Ames? Liddell asked, smooth returning to smooth. Because the next trespass will target him, Wolfe said. In here, trespassers are fed to logic. Sophia's eyes flicked to me. I gave her a small nod that meant the locks would get religion. Saul, ghosting the doorway, made a tiny sign with his hand. Wexler still on post. Good. Harrow rose, portfolio clasped like a clutch that might bite. "If you're wrong, Mr. Wolfe." "I am not," he said, so simply that the room rebalanced around the sentence. "If I were, you would have found something this afternoon because your counterfeit is an excellent mimic. But mimics fail at purpose. You were aligning to visibility, not to verity." Mrs. Danforth stood, smoothing her gloves with authority. "At 4, then. I expect the museum to comport itself." She eyed Harrow and Liddell in turn. "And I expect my name not to appear in any account until there is something noble to attach it to." When they had left, Capel last, after a long look at the box he couldn't take. Wolfe let out breath as if he had been holding the building in his chest. "Archie," he said, "bar the rear and the cellar. Saul will watch the street. Ms. Wren, please examine the disc once more for any residue that might identify a former partner. Mr. Ames, sit and try not to imagine glory. It stains." I did the rounds. By the time I returned, Sophia had a cotton swab resting in a shallow dish like evidence in good linen. Trace of amber, the cheap kind used to fake copal, and lamp black. Someone made a transfer, yes, but not in our lab. The binder is wrong. Too much oil. A studio, not a conservation bench. "Malloy?" I asked. "Harrow," Sophia said, surprising me. She used to do her own tracings in graduate school and hated asking favors. Her lab notes from back then always smelled like studio, not lab. Wolfe nodded once. She made the counterfeit herself to control the tempo. Mr. Liddell supplied witnesses, Mr. Capel supplied form, Mr. Malloy supplied hands. We will oblige them to supply shame. The phone rang. I answered and got Saul. "Wexler just swapped drivers," he said. "New man, same chin, different license. They're expecting movement at 4. "They're getting it," I told him, with a cop holding the shovel. When I relayed it, Wolfe's mouth did what passes with him for a smile, a fractional quirk that means dessert will be timely. "Good," he said. "This has gone on long enough without the police earning their keep." He lifted the disc, regarded its grooves, and set it down with the care you reserve for a tool that has finished its work. At 4, they will lift a proper stone and find what men hide for one reason only, to keep what is theirs from becoming what is owed. "Archie, bring the car at 3:40. I will not go to the park, but I will be in session when they return, and they will return." "You're betting the find brings them running?" I asked. "I'm not betting," he said. "I'm arranging appetite." At 3:40 I brought the car around, and Wolfe watched me go, the way a general watches a scout leave a trench, with faith in the plan and low expectations for the world. Sophia took the back seat with the tube under her arm like a baton. Ames stayed put under Fritz's benign tyranny and the combined might of our locks. Saul ghosted from a doorway, 2 houses down, and slid into his own vehicle behind us. The street had already taken a breath it wouldn't let out until after 4. The ramble was ringed with officialdom by the time we got there. Capel had earned himself 2 blue uniforms and a sergeant who looked at the ground as if it owed him money. A middle-aged captain with a patient face. Ruiz by his bar took my name with the kind of nod that means he hasn't decided yet whether he'll like your help. The donors arrived in a town car that tried to make its own lane. The hat descended with ceremony. Liddell arranged his smile. Harrow arranged her contempt. Malloy clutched a portfolio as if it could testify. Wexler's sedan showed at the curb and didn't approach, which is sometimes how men approach. "Mr. Goodwin," Captain Ruiz said, "you're the one who says a precise stone is more promising than 3 theatrical ones." "I'm the one who works for the man who says that," I told him, "and he says it with better grammar. This is Ms. Wren, conservation. She'll tell you when you're about to turn a relic into confetti." Sophia stepped in and made the ground a lab by pointing. "There," she said. tapping the photo Wolfe had sent, and the spot where the slope broke shallow. "You lift here, not there, and you don't pry, you coax." Capel tried to own it by squatting first. Ruiz put a hand on his shoulder as gently as a judge. "Let's not make a habit of enthusiasm," he suggested. The sergeant and a uniform took the edge of the stone and eased it up with a pair of slings like a team with delicate luggage. The flag sighed. Beneath was earth that had minded its business for longer than most of us keep promises. Sophia knelt and inhaled without touching. "Resin," she said. "Not strong. Old." She pointed 2 inches in. "Brush." A uniform with the right brush. Somebody had read the email, whisked soil until a dull gleam made an appearance. It wasn't gold, it was the color metal turns when time has been their roommate. Captain Ruiz looked at me. I looked at him. We both looked at Harrow, who didn't blink. Liddell leaned, calibrated for ownership. Capel's jaw squared. The donors held their breath as if the air had been priced. The uniform eased out a tube the length of a man's palm, capped at both ends, wrapped once, decades ago, in something that had been cloth and now remembered being cloth. The smell of amber and lamp black came up like a ghost with good manners. Ruiz took it into a bag with an evidence number that matched a notebook that matched his calm. "Here or precinct?" he asked, which was generous and aimed at me because I had the defect of being at the center of the thing without wearing a badge. "Here," Sophia said before I could answer. "If it's fragile, moving it warm and breathing buys us seconds." Harrow cleared her throat so quietly it scolded. "Captain, its contents, if museum property, are best opened in a controlled environment at the museum." "That's one argument," Ruiz said. "The other is that the museum is where some of the problems seem to come from. No offense." He studied the cap. "There's a thread of wax. Ms. Wren." "Warm it," she said. "Don't scrape." They warmed it with a hand lamp one of the interns held like a relic in training. The wax let go with the resignation of a seal that knows its time. Inside, Ruiz coaxed out a roll, bound with blackened string. He unwrapped it with fingers better than most surgeons I've seen and spread it on a clean board someone had imagined would be useful. The first page was a sliver of tracing paper with grid marks in a hand I'd already met that morning. Dannon's. The second was a narrow ledger leaf, edges brittle, writing tight and furious enough to etch. Ruiz read aloud the way a man reads a note pinned to a baby. "For whoever is honest next, the disc aligns the grid to the oak, but the oak is gone. This is not a treasure hunt. It is a proof of theft. My own obtuseness included. See the codes below. T&M consignment numbers match deaccession slips that never were. Initials are the hands that carried them. Keep this where greed thinks to look for its reward so that it finds its indictment. Signed with a slash that had practiced being a signature. There's a list." He ran a finger without touching. "Dates 2 decades old. T&M, Thorne and Malloy, followed by numbers. Beside them, initials in the pairs. MH repeated VL twice, a third column of OK on some, a fourth of PM on the last few. Every line has the word OS or show scribbled. Dannon wasn't writing poetry. Liddell went the color of plausible deniability. Initials are ambiguous by nature, he said. VL could be any number of... Not any number, I said. Just enough for one if you're counting donors by first names. And if T&M is Thorne and Malloy, it's a logistics firm that moves expensive things quietly. Ask Mr. Wexler's dent. Capel didn't like his initials any better. Okay, doesn't. It could be a comment. It could, Ruiz said mildly. But the world is rarely that kind. Ms. Harrow? She had her mouth ready. If Dannon suspected irregularities 20 years ago, he should have taken it to the board. He was a fine scholar and an uneven politician. He wrote indictments when memos would have sufficed. He hid an indictment where you'd stage a discovery, I said. That's politics. Malloy swallowed hard enough to be heard by ants. PM doesn't have to be me, he whispered, and then looked like he regretted auditioning to be a suspect in public. Ruiz slid the ledger sheet into a second bag, sealed it, and wrote with the tidy satisfaction of a man whose pen has authority. He looked at Harrow and then at Liddell. I will be asking for records. You can either put them in a box I carry, or I can go and get a warrant and a bigger box. Your choice changes my schedule, not my day. Mrs. Danforth put a hand on her hat to keep it from fainting. Captain, if there has been impropriety,